Hello and welcome to Cinema to the Letter. This episode's that classic known as Destroy All Monsters. On Cinema to the Letter, we break down the very nature of cinema, letter by letter. For each episode of a film miniseries topic, we cover 6 films that fit a C for classic, I for indie, N for new, E for egregious, M for masterpiece, and A for atypical. Because who doesn't love an acronym, am I right? I am Thomas. In my residence over on Monsterland, I got this really cheap. I don't know how I was able to afford such a palatial estate on Monster Island. I'm sure everything will go well and insurance won't fuck me over so royally.
I mean, I hear rent's cheap on Monsterland these days.
Yeah.
Um,
High turnover, though.
oh, hello. I'm Bryan, and I think we need to talk about Minila and how much of a terrible nepo baby he is. I think
The worst nepo baby.
The worst.
Well, as you can tell, Bryan and I aren't alone here. We have a guest with us. He's a buddy of mine from over at Gruesome Magazine, and he has done some filmmaking stuff in his time, and just a big old monster in his own right. Bill Mulligan. Bill, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me on, guys. Really appreciate it, because if I had to pick one love, well, that would be hard to do. But right up there with Mario Bava and Ray Harryhausen, Godzilla. And all that comes with it.
It's a shame they never collaborated. Would have been a wonderful sight.
Mario Bava almost made a movie called Baby Kong.
Oh.
Yeah. And if he could have gotten Ray Harryhausen, no, it's one of those bullets dodged. It looks like even people who love Bava as I do are thankful that that was one of those projects that never quite came together.
Well, Bill, it's important we, I guess kind of go in here before we start talking about our official C for Classic pick, Destroy All Monsters, for this Godzilla season, the first episode of our Godzilla season. We should probably get everybody's sort of origins and path of sorts with Godzilla, how we got started with the big old monster. So, Bill, what's your origin story with Godzilla? Where did that start?
Okay, so I know I don't look it, but I'm an old guy. And back in the day, for reasons I'm sure lost to time, on Thanksgiving in New York City, they would play, I think it was Channel 9, they would play gorilla movies, because what goes better with Thanksgiving than gorillas? They would play King Kong, Son of Kong, Mighty Joe Young, and usually either King Kong escapes, but usually more often King Kong versus Godzilla. And I'm pretty sure that was the first Godzilla movie I saw. And that's a great first movie to see when you're a kid. They also had a thing called the 4:30 movie, where they would, weirdly, they would show the same movie at 4:30. You probably picked that up every day for a week. One week it was King Kong. One week it was the original Godzilla. And I watched them 5 times. Every single day. That week, I was glued to the set. This was just the formative years. So very early on, the first film I actually remember seeing was The Black Scorpion. So I've just been a huge lover of monsters for as long as I can remember watching movies. And Godzilla, man, I love them all. Even the ones that I look back on now as not being terribly great. Son of Godzilla, I'm looking right at you. I loved them. And so yeah, then you go back and you watch them again, and how much of that love is nostalgia and how much of it is just solid good filmmaking. And Destroy All Monsters is a little bit of both. But I will always love Godzilla, and there is no one happier on earth right now than to see everybody loving Godzilla -1. I'm not one of these people who wins something that they've loved that was always kind of on the outs there, suddenly picks up some love from the normal people. It's like, I liked it when it wasn't cool. It's like, no, I'm very, very happy that people are finally getting the love that we've all had for this genre, this idea, this creature. Great time to be a Godzilla fan.
For sure, definitely. Bryan, what about you? By contrast, you hadn't really seen a lot of Godzilla stuff before this miniseries.
Not really. I was actually trying to think back, like, what was the first Godzilla movie I saw, and weirdly enough, it was the 2014 movie, the Gareth Edwards movie, because I saw it in theaters, and like that was when I was kind of really starting to go to the movies like every week, I think, and so I think that was just kind of like, oh, it's a big movie, it's Godzilla, it's a big American production of Godzilla, and I saw it and I loved it back in 2014. I still love it today. But then I went back and like I think watched only the original Godzilla 1954. If it just kind of like obviously a very important movie, very important monster movie, all that stuff. And yeah, I just never really watched any of the other ones because it always in my mind felt like, oh, there's like a million of these, and they've made so many of them over this decades. I just don't know how to even get into it. But yeah, I've been doing it because of obviously the miniseries we're doing. I've watched all the Showa era movies so far, and it's been so much fun to go back and watch these, like the old 60s ones especially. I think and I mean we'll talk about kind of the visual effects and all that stuff that is very 60s about these movies, but I've just really been loving them, and especially it's nice to kind of see the evolution of these movies, right? Because in my mind I was like, I know Godzilla either as like, from the original 54 movie of he is this metaphor for, nuclear fear. But you kind of, you look at like GIFs and stuff like that on the internet, and it's like stuff from these later Showa movies where he like has a son and he's like drop kicking people and like all this kind of a lot of goofier stuff. But it's been good to kind of see the arc of this era of Godzilla as well.
Well, I mean, I remember when I was younger, the first inkling I got of Godzilla at all was the bit in Pee-wee's Big Adventure. During Bryan, you haven't seen Pee-wee's Big Adventure still, so there's a bit spoilers for this like 30-year-old movie. In Pee-wee's Big Adventure, during the climax, where he's at like the Warner Brothers lot, he goes through several different movie productions, one of which is just a Godzilla movie where it's a guy in a Godzilla suit fighting against King Ghidorah, who's flying around, and then Pee-wee just like rides it on his bike, and Godzilla becomes a part of like the cavalcade of it. And I was like, what the fuck even is this? I'm like a kid, and I have no idea what the hell any of this is related to. And then just through like pop culture, you definitely get like exposure, like, okay, Godzilla is like this big guy in a suit or whatever. The movies have a cheesy connotation to them culturally. And then I remember seeing the original 54 movie like in high school, being awed by like, oh my god, it's, this very dour, upsetting movie that includes a guy in a big rubber suit. And then I really got into the Showa era, which is part of the era we're talking about today, when I first got the Criterion Channel streaming service. And one of the big incentives was the fact they had most of the Showa era movies on there. So I was definitely just like, I want to go through these. It was like in prep for Godzilla King of the Monsters coming out in 2019. And then during the pandemic, and especially in the lead up to Godzilla vs. Kong, the 2021 one, I was like, well, I might as well finish it out. So I went through the Heisei and Millennium era ones. And yeah, it's fascinating, especially like when I watch them, I just realize like, oh wait, I kind of get the appeal because it kind of appeals to the same part of my brain that as a kid loved Pokemon. Where it's just like all these different monsters, all these different like creatures who have their own special skills and have their own distinctive designs. It just really like kind of hooked me into that same kind of like childlike fascination of like, I gotta see them all. And in Destroy All Monsters, you get a fair amount of them.
Yeah.
But yeah, let's go ahead and jump into our movie then. Let's go ahead and we'll play the trailer here for a bit for Destroy All Monsters.
Destroy all monsters. Orders the conclave of nations when unknown powers from outer space attack our world with gargantuan man-killers. Then the armies of our world unite. armies versus mad monsters for possession of planet Earth. Destroy all monsters.
So, Destroy All Monsters, also known as, we should mention this, that the Godzilla movies go by various different titles depending on the country they're released in, and I have a few here. I have, the other titles for Destroy All Monsters include All Monsters Attack, Attack of the Marching Monsters, Monster Attack March, that sounds more like a theme, and then The March of the Monsters also sounds like... Did Akira Ikefube title one of his tracks that? It sounds like it. But then the UK title is Operation Monsterland. Then the Italian title is King Kong's Heirs. I have several questions about that.
That's a good one.
Well, that's not even the weirdest one,
No.
because of course, in Germany, yes, it is called Frankenstein and the Monsters from Space, which there is at least a reasoning for that, because if you look at any of the titles for the Godzilla movies released after Frankenstein Conquers the World, which somebody might talk about in a bit, put a pin in that. But that movie was so successful in Germany that they're like, we gotta slap Frankenstein on all these titles.
It's crazy.
Oh, great, wild stuff. But yes, this came out August 1st, 1968 in Japan, from director Ishiro Honda, who we definitely need to talk about, because Ishiro Honda directed the original Gojira in 1954, and directed a solid amount of the Showa-era movies, 8 of them total. Previously to this, he'd done, along with the original Gojira, King Kong vs. Godzilla, Mothra vs. Godzilla, Ghidorah the Three-Headed Monster, Invasion of the Astro Monsters, and then after Destroy All Monsters, he would do All Monsters Attack and Terror of Mechagodzilla. He's definitely considered kind of like the big auteur who helped Godzilla become what he was. And how do you feel about him, Bill? Especially, what do you think of the works of Ishiro Honda, Godzilla or otherwise?
On the Godzilla series, he hit 7 out of 8, which is a pretty enviable record. There's just one I don't like. But, every great filmmaker should have at least one film you don't like, just so you know you're not just seeing this through the eyes of someone in love. He's a really good filmmaker. His stuff is always a cut above, and he didn't get the credit. I think a lot of his stuff hasn't been seen in the US, the non-monster stuff, non-science fiction or horror. But this is a man who was best buddies with Kurosawa, and who made films with Kurosawa, especially toward the end. After Honda had retired, Kurosawa brought him in as, associate director, assistant director, whatever it was. By that point, Kurosawa was having trouble even being able to see. Worked on some gorgeous films. Kurosawa is not a guy who's going to bring in some hack. This was a guy who was able to really do some excellent work on pretty low budgets, using technologies that they were still kind of playing with at the time. I love his stuff. It's always good. Even in the little technical things, it's easy to get blown away just by the spectacle of the monsters and everything, to lose sight of the fact that his stuff looks better than a lot of the other Godzilla movies. Why? Knows how to use a camera, technically proficient. The original Gojira is a gorgeous film. I mean, it makes you almost wish they'd always stayed in black and white with that high speed photography. It's nightmarish, and it's unique. None of the other Godzilla movies are anything like the original. Maybe they realized early on you can only do that nightmare so many times, but very quickly they went into monster mash, monsters fighting monsters, and then branching out into all the other more science fiction, more childishness, more comedy. Godzilla's gone through so many stages, but Honda's solid. Honda's there, and if I always mispronounce the composer,
Akira Ikefube?
Yes, if he's doing the music, you're going to have a great time, because they just were so iconic and just really knew what they were doing. Took a silly concept and made it work, except for that Manila on Monster Island with his goofy voice. And yeah,
I don't know. Godzilla told me to fight my own battles,
yeah, taught me a lot about bullying. I went to school the next day and stood up to my bullies, and I got slapped like Ghidorah at the end of Destroy All Monsters. They just ganged up on me. It was like 12 on 1. I never had a chance.
All three of your heads gone.
Oh,
we only see
ooh.
one of them now.
That's, well, you can see how badly I was
Now we
beaten.
know.
I mean, yeah, it's interesting, I think, because, like, I only knew him as he made the original Godzilla, and I don't think I ever had any concept of like, this, because they bring him back, it feels like. They bring him back when it's, like, things are kind of at their worst, almost, when kind of things are starting to go off the rails. I think they're like, Ishiro, come back, make another one, come on, like, teach us all, how it's done. And, like, I, the other kind of director of this Showa era is Jun Fukuda, and I like him. I would say I think I like some of his movies that he did, but you do notice a very big difference between him and Honda, and I actually kind of like that distinction where Fukuda kind of leaned more into the goofiness and the kind of child kind of focused, but I think Honda always really wanted a sense of, like, genuine drama and really genuine, like, character building and world building and stuff like that. And I think that's why, like, a lot of the characters and the kind of just the themes feel a lot more prevalent when it's an Ishiro Honda directed movie versus, like, any of the other guys doing them. And yeah, I haven't seen really any of his other non Godzilla. Well, I've seen Rodan and Mothra, but other than those, I haven't seen anything else he's done. And yeah, it does seem like kind of a shame, because I'm sure there's a lot of great films in there that are just not as talked about, which is interesting, because he is a very important filmmaker, especially not just considering the original Godzilla, but also, like, the later ones he directed and how he kind of made this movie, which is by a lot of people, I think, considered the pinnacle of the kind of Showa era. But even Terror of Mechagodzilla, which I have a little bit of fondness for, even though I know someone here doesn't. But yeah, no, I really love his direction, and I especially that there's a lot of things we'll talk about. I think a lot of just filmmaking choices that I find really interesting from him. But yeah, what about you, Thomas?
Well, I mean, I've definitely seen a lot of the monster stuff and kind of prepped for this. I've been watching a couple of his different ones, and I think it's interesting when you do compare it to something that is genre-based but isn't as monster-focused. Like, I recently watched Matango.
Oh, good
which
one.
I'm sure... Yes, a very good one. Brian, this is a movie about, like, a group of assholes who run a boat, who, like, go off on this boat and then get caught in basically, like, the Bermuda Triangle. And they're stuck on this island that has these mushrooms that are, like, have weird psychic powers and are, like, calling to them, basically. It's a fascinating movie, I think, particularly it was made in 1963, and it feels very kind of, like, influential on, especially a lot of, like, survivalist, kind of like, we're all stuck in one space kind of thrillers. And you've seen it as well, Bill, I assume.
Oh, yes. That was a holy grail for a long time, because it didn't get shown on TV very often. And there's always, there's always one of these two films. You see it in Famous Monsters, or you've heard about it, you read it in a book, and you're just, every time TV Guide would come once a week, okay, I'm really dating myself now, and I would just go through with a pen and circle. When we didn't have VCRs back then, boys and girls, either, so you had to set the old alarm clock for 2 a.m. when Channel 11 was showing all these weird science fiction and horror films, and stay up late. And it took forever for me to find a gray market copy of Mentango. And I wish I'd waited a little bit, because it was such a crap copy. It didn't really show just how beautiful the color palette and everything in that film is.
Yeah.
It's sort of psychedelic, and it's sort of interesting, because that wasn't really a thing when they made this movie.
True.
So he was ahead of his time.
Yeah, there's even a point where they say, like, in the dialogue, something about, like, oh, I heard about these guys who took mushrooms and had psychedelic trips. I'm like, crazy. Like, you have to explain that to people in 1963, that is a thing that people do. It's wild. But yeah, great movie. It's on Criterion streaming service now, as of when we're at least recording this. Would definitely recommend that one. But yeah, it's so interesting when you consider especially the fact that, like, Ishiro Honda, as much as he doesn't get as much credit for, a lot of his stuff, there's also the factor that he's technically one of 2 directors that's involved in a lot of these Godzilla movies. Because you also have the guy who's directing the special effects, who in most cases, for the first several, was a guy named Eiji Tsuburaya, which, apologies if I mispronounced this or any other names this whole season.
You're doing better than I ever
right
will.
now. But he basically, because in with Toho, has really developed with the first Godzilla. Basically, you would have like two units, one doing like all the human stuff, and one doing the tokusatsu, which is the term for special photography or like special effects heavy genre stuff, like most of the people in the suits. And from what I understand, like the two of them rarely really communicated beyond like initial pre-production meetings. Like during shooting, there was never much conversation. They just kind of like complete each other, basically. Although I know apparently their relationship became kind of tense because this is the first one without him as a special effects director. It's a guy named Sadamasa Irakawa, who had worked under Tsuburaya a lot of the time. And it is fascinating how you never really feel that with the Ishiro Honda movies. There's like two separate units going on. It just feels so whole of a piece. And it's a real testament to the fact that like what Ishiro Honda does grounding the human elements just enough to where you're like invested, but at the same time it's not like intense character drama because we gotta make time for the monster stuff. It feels really seamless.
It's a really difficult, I think, tightrope that these movies have to walk with their character stuff. And I think like, you know, later this season, we're going to talk about one of the newer Godzilla movies, the one X-Kong, The New Empire, which just came out. And I think in that we talk a lot about the kind of human elements and how in the newer films they're really lacking. And I think these Showa era movies, and specifically the Honda movies, I think really show that tightrope of you need them to be really interesting and you need to care about them and you need to like be able to distinguish who these people are and what they do and kind of all that stuff. But I don't think that, you know, you can't give too much and kind of invest too heavily into these characters because that's not why people came to see the movie. They want to see the big monsters and they want to fight. Like it's a really difficult tightrope to walk. And I think this movie is one of the better examples, I think, of walking that tightrope of how you handle human characters and give you something to care about, but also kind of, you know, give you the monster and the reason that you kind of came to see the movie, I think.
It's tricky too, because I saw a review where they rated how much monster each movie had. And this was near the bottom of the list. But I think right by it, maybe even less, was the original Gojira. So the quality, how good the movies were, was not entirely dependent on how much monster action we have. But I was astonished to see it was something like 7 or 8 minutes. I'm like, really, so little? But this stuff was not easy to film. And as a big stop motion fan, I was genetically predisposed not to like man in suit stuff. But even as a kid, I could appreciate just how good the model work was when they're tearing up the city. These things were meticulously created. They didn't just fall over like cardboard. I've seen some movies that were. When I say I love stop motion, what I really mean is I love Ray Harryhausen, because if it's not him and a handful of other creators like Jim Danforth, bad stop motion is wretched. And same with this suitmation or whatever you want to call it, man in suit. If it's done well, like it is here, it's perfectly good. It's perfectly adequate. It has its own charms and works really well. If it's done badly, and I've seen plenty of those too, it's the worst. It's the pits. These folks took pride in their work. You know, sometimes you could see a string. Sometimes, you know, you could tell they were shooting the actor with a flare gun. I actually got to meet the guy who played Godzilla in most of the early ones. I think by the time of Destroy All Monsters, he was no longer doing it. And I'm drawing a blank on his name right now. I have an autographed poster hanging up there. It was right
are you talking about Haru Nakajima?
Yes. It was short, just a year or so before he passed away. He was coming through America, and listening to his stories was absolutely charming. His granddaughter was translating for him, and you realize, man, these guys, he was in a big flammable rubber suit and they were shooting him with flares. It caught on fire frequently. You know, everyone who criticizes, man, the tank guys cannot hit Godzilla to save. Well, you know, they're trying not to hit it all the time because he would have gone up like he was in a big greasy oil filled suit. And he did catch on fire, and the ropes did break when he was playing Rodan, and all kinds of terrible things happened. But he told us all these stories. He was at the simultaneously humble, but you could see there was pride in his work, and he was very happy, to be able to contribute things like being able to do the little Godzilla jig from was it an Invasion of the Astro Monsters?
Where he like jumps up and down. Hell
Yeah,
yeah.
which he wanted to do. He wanted to do it in this one too. He tried to talk Honda into letting him do that after they killed Ghidorah, and Honda was like, "Yeah, no."
He apparently did not like that Invasion of the Astro Monsters. That's apparently one of his few gripes with that movie.
And yes, it's silly, but I can't imagine life without it. So
no, really not. It's such an important image.
Yeah.
But I by the way, Nakajima is actually our Godzilla here.
Oh,
He
good.
lasted until Godzilla versus Gigan. That was the last one.
Okay.
Right. Which you can kind of tell, like, even in, like, the last three of the Showa era. It's three different people, I believe, and it feels kind of inconsistent.
I just said he wanted Honda to let him do this, so obviously he had to be in the suit. It's been a long week. I know it's
But yeah, I really love, especially like in these early movies, how you can see him developing Godzilla as a character. I think even before, like, because obviously there's the narrative of Godzilla, his sort of arc is he initially starts off as this monstrous, unholy being that represents nuclear fallout. And then slowly he becomes more of just an antagonist in like the first couple movies that's kind of like potentially beatable. And then it's really around, like, Ghidorah the three-headed monster. That's the first time they make him a bit of a hero. Like, near the end. They have to convince him, though, which is my favorite scene. Everyone just talking to each other. So good
Monster
in that movie.
talk.
But, yo, great. Godzilla, what terrible language. My favorite. Love it so much. So from there, like, we start seeing him as more of a hero. He gets a kid, and all this other stuff. And I just love the fact that even though, like, in this movie, he is technically a hero to some degree by the end of it, especially, Godzilla's still mean. Godzilla's still, like, so shitty to so many people. So many monsters in these fucking movies, and it's so good. How do you feel about the sort of arc, Bryan, having seen it recently?
Yeah, it's kind of, I was really kind of confused. Like, how are they gonna, kind of make that transition? And it is kind of interesting to think about that, like, the original Godzilla is in 1954, and they make Godzilla Raids Again, and King Kong versus Godzilla isn't until 62. But then, really, kind of the franchise fully starts, I think, with Mothra versus Godzilla. Kind of, in a way, I think, and that's especially when it gets like kind of annualized. And I find it interesting. I think how they, make Godzilla kind of on our side, essentially, even though they're finding ways, I think, to like still make him menacing, right? Which the whole plot of this movie is like, Godzilla's on our side, he's great, but if aliens from another planet come and like control him, then it's bad for us. It's finding ways to kind of still make him this terrifying creature, which I really love, and I think they find some really creative ways to do it. Especially in this movie, I think. And I also just love, the kind of recurring thing through all these movies, even though they're not really connected in any way, but that him and Ghidorah are like arch rivals, and like they always bring Ghidorah back. Some planet always, hires him to do their bidding or whatever. But yeah, I love it. And it is like, because I was kind of thinking like, oh, it's going to be fully like goofy. Like Godzilla's just going to be like he's gonna be dancing and jumping, doing whatever, but yeah, they still find a way to make him like terrifying and scary, and he still like causes damage, and like in this movie he just like straight up kills like a whole ship of people, and it's terrifying. It is, but it's also kind of it's also walking that line of like Godzilla is kind of this like mascot figure almost, but we also still have to kind of remember the origin of where he kind of came from, and I think Honda really nails that. But yeah, it's just an interesting kind of arc to see over all these movies, and the kind of ebbs and flows, because sometimes it does go more goofy and sometimes it gets very serious and very dark.
My favorite thing, honestly, thinking about with Nakajima is particularly how he uses his arms. Like, so much of Godzilla stuff is like him lifting them up in the air in triumph, or whenever he's like stomping on something, like in the big scene where it's like him and Manda destroying some stuff, and you see just in the background Godzilla, like his arms are back, like he's almost trying to fly as he's like stomping the shit out of buildings. Like, he's really gotta get, and particularly also with the final battle with Ghidorah's heads, he's just throwing them down, and like he's almost pointing like, stay down there, motherfucker, don't you get up.
I like right before the fight when he's pacing back side to side,
yes.
back and forth. He's like Mike Tyson just waiting for that bell to ring.
Yeah, and I mean the sort of like performance that we like of Godzilla is such an interesting thing, because like it is this big rubber suit, and yet I think like he has such a personality in all these movies, right? Like, and I think the fact that he can be kind of expressive in that weird way, right? Like when he's pacing, kind of getting ready for the fight, or like when he's like jumping up and down in Invasion of Astro Monster or whatever, like the performance really matters. And like it is kind of, especially I think while I was growing up, it was like, oh, these are like guys in suits, they look kind of cheap, you know, they're cheesy, as people would say, like, but you really watch, especially watching all of them, you get a sense of like the performance that you have to kind of, you know, the actors has to do as these monsters. It's a real like difficult thing to do, to kind of make them expressive in this way. And he is kind of funny in a weird way, like physically he's kind of funny, especially he kind of flails his arms around sometimes when he's like, you know, like he's doing the whole like, you know, where are you, come on, kind of thing.
He's doing James Cagney. It's great.
Yeah, but it's a great kind of way to look at just how difficult it must have been to sort of make him feel this distinctive. It's so fascinating to look at, and I can't really wrap my head around it entirely, because I've watched all like 14 or 15 of them recently, but like, yeah, it's such a great way of making Godzilla feel very expressive and interesting, I think.
It's even more difficult when you realize it's like his head is not in Godzilla's head, it's somewhere around his neck.
Right.
The eyes don't move. They've had a few, I think in Son of Godzilla they actually did have movable eyes, but they look pretty lame. There's a lot of really good physical mime dance moves. I don't know what his background was that he was able to pull it out. Now, one of the things you talk about, the evolution, the original Godzilla costume was a nightmare. Like, they made it and they put him in it and they said, take a step, and he just fell over. It was almost completely immovable. They had to cut it up and do a few tricks to get anything out of it. They did get better as time went on. They were able to build suits that allowed them to do the kind of rough and tumble wrestling moves that would be necessary. But yeah, it's a cool performance. I feel bad for the guy who plays Anguirus, because you're on your hands and knees, but you're trying not to make it look obvious that you're on your hands and knees.
Yeah, those are that one is so. It's I can't really like imagine how those are kind of done, the kind of four-legged ones, because they look great. Like, I think Anguirus looks really great, and I think I like about this movie and these Showa era movies is like they're a bit chintzy, you know, like it's that kind of 60s kind of sci-fi thing. I've recently been watching like a lot of Star Trek, the original series, and it's kind of the same thing of like it looks a bit cheap, but in like a really charming way, I think. You know, like all the consoles and everything have like a certain like look to them and stuff, and yeah, it kind of the same with the suits and everything, and just I really can't wrap my head around how those like VFX sequences were
good
shot,
camera
really,
angles,
because
now, you raise a really good point too, because it's like if they were shooting Star Trek now and they did the original episode Arena where we're introduced to the Gorns, oh, they'd use CGI and those Gorns would be able to hop around like velociraptors and all that. And while that is cool and neat and not a bad idea, it distracts you from the story. I was perfectly happy. I wasn't an idiot. I knew it was just a guy in a lizard costume. And that's fine. That's all it needed to be. Let's get to the story. It was the story. It was a good story, and a fun episode. It doesn't. Sometimes the chintziness, like old Doctor Who, you just accept that. That's what Daleks look like. They got plungers coming out. They just they used whatever they had lying around the set to build these monsters. That's what we have. Just accept it and let's go on with the story, and that's fine.
What's so key is, especially like with suit actors in general, like always been a big fan. I always like to shout out suit actors whenever we discuss stuff that has like sort of, especially like the genre stuff. And I think it's just because like it's so difficult to make any of this shit work practically, especially at this time. Like you mentioned, like this technology and all these like techniques were developed with the first Godzilla, and we're like only about like 14 movies in at this point, and it's still just like we're playing stuff on the fly. That's what's so great, especially if you watch the Ishiro Honda movies. You can see like him experimenting, him and Tosuburaya like really experimenting with the ideas about like, let's have more perspective shots, let's have more stuff like with humans just walking right behind like Godzilla's feet, which I think this is some of the best examples of that. Like that whole sequence near the climax where they're on the island and you can see Godzilla in the background. It's probably some of the best like integration. Even like you do see some rear screen projection stuff. But it all just still feels like so immersed just because like somebody had to do this optically. That's fucking crazy.
Yeah.
And it still looks this great.
Yeah, and I mean another element I think that goes into the way that these movies look is the color. Right? Because like Bill, you said earlier, like you watch the original one and you're like, you almost wish they could have kept making them in black and white. But like you watch these in color and they're just gorgeous. Like that '60s like color is just like it pops. And everyone's wearing like all their suits are like yellow, red, like they're all like primary colors, and everything looks like that, and it just pops like so much in a way that I really love. It's something I love about like Star Trek as well, or like just the way that like it's like color has like just been invented, and like in the case with Star Trek, I was like, man, if you had a color TV in the '60s, like this must have been like crazy to see, because like they're really just throwing like color everywhere. And same with a lot of these, especially in the visual effects like segments where it's like just flares and like everything is like popping off. It's really, really gorgeous, I think.
Particularly the Firebird at the end?
The Firebird. What a
Fire
disappointment.
Dragon.
Firebird.
Fire Dragon, yes, the Fire Dragon.
Hey, I don't mean to tell aliens their business and everything, but why'd they save that for after Ghidorah, he probably could have used a little bit of help. Could have used any help. What was the plan here? Ghidorah was last seen being defeated by just Godzilla and Rodan and Mothra. Okay, well, now we got them plus another 9 monsters. I'm amazed he lasted as long as he did.
Part of me does imagine that King Ghidorah would kind of be, given his, very subtle title that he put in front of his name of King, he seems like a guy who'd be like, nah, I can do it. Yeah. Fuck them, I can do it. Yeah. Oh, there's a few more of them? Whatever, Gorosaurus, fuck off. I don't care.
Yeah, what is he going to do? Drop kick me?
Well, he's also probably just like, last time Godzilla got me, but this time I'm fucking back.
Now I'm prepared.
Yeah, like I'm gonna get him. What, he's got a big spider, which, gosh, that Thomas, that really got me.
I was fearful of you. Bill, he's fairly arachnophobic, so
well, yeah, listen. Phobia implies an irrational fear. If there was a spider the size of my school, I think that's a rational fear. I think the only irrational thing would not be to scream and run. I'll bet one of Ghidorah's heads would be telling the others, I don't think this is a great plan, guys. And they're just like, shut up. We got this. He's probably the last one to go. He's the one who had the ultimate humiliation of being taken out by Manila.
Oh, that's true.
And I thought that was the greatest scene ever. I thought that was the greatest shot when I was a little kid and he blew that dopey smoke ring, because I saw Son of Godzilla before I saw Destroy All Monsters. That little radiation ring, and it goes around Ghidorah's neck. I'm like, oh, well, life doesn't get any better than this. That was just the best.
Even though what I do kind of like is you can tell there's certain points, especially when he like steps on Ghidorah's body at the end, that's Godzilla being like, come on, let the kid do something.
Yeah.
God, he just sat here. He wasn't able to do anything. Look, I'm not gonna put my kid into fucking battle.
His son was born in the 60s. Now it's 1999. He has not grown at all. Maybe puberty doesn't
I
work.
didn't even think about that.
Maybe it doesn't work for monsters the way it does for us. Maybe they have a long childhood.
Yeah, it's a Grogu thing. Sure, we'll go with that. That's what it is.
I mean, oh gosh, I guess should we talk about Minila while we're
Sure.
here in him?
We might as well. Yeah, we might as well because he's your background currently, Bryan.
Yeah, he is.
So I'm sure you're a big fan.
Who isn't?
I kind of hate him, and I think he's a little abomination. Because like, he's kind of cute when he first pops up. You're like, oh, this is kind of cute. He's a little Godzilla, and then you just like look at him some more, and he's kind of ugly to look at. Like
He's hideous.
Texture-wise, everything. It's very weird. I mean, there's the whole All Monsters Attack, that movie, which really
that
features
movie.
him, and it's the worst Godzilla movie for me thus far. I don't know if you guys have.
Oh, no,
you
it's the
think-
worst.
Okay.
Period. End of sentence.
It's one of the worst, even though there is like a weird meta context that makes that movie kind of fascinating. Even though it's terrible, this weird like meta thing of like Godzilla's not real. What are you talking about? It's like, but I want to go to him because my parents have abandoned me in this apartment.
The way they have like the little bubbles above above their heads, it's just that's where I'm like,
Yeah.
okay, this has gone off the rails. We need to,
Yeah, Ishiro Honda loved that movie and said
He
it was
loved
like
it. And smarter man than I am, so.
It's also the only one where he shot the effects, I believe, because by that point they were so cheap in the Showa era that it's like we're not going to have another special effects unit. You just shoot everything,
Right.
and you can tell.
Well, most of it's flashbacks. Most of it is footage from,
Well,
and
sure,
even
it's not
even
footage.
Destroy All Monsters has some reused footage. And I mean, I understand you got to squeeze a buck here and there, but I wish they could have built a few more of the costumes. I wish we could have seen more of Varan or any of Baragon, but I guess the suits were just too far gone. They had to choose their poison. Even Rodan has seen better days.
Yeah, he is.
Yeah, especially the close-ups where you can tell like they still have the big hard plastic one
Mhm.
that just is for the flying scenes, but then his close-ups where he just kind of looks like a Sesame Street Muppet.
He looked like they'd stored him face down in a basement somewhere, so his beak is now kind of like a
His
big
beak is so
nose.
bent. Yes.
Expect to do Jimmy Durante impersonation or something.
He also has the most human eyes, which is so weird.
Yeah, that
Like,
very
compared to everyone
disturbing.
else, it's really weird.
And that's weird too, because Rodan, when I finally got to see Rodan, the original Rodan, I was like blown away with
Oh, that's
how
a great
deathly
movie.
serious it was and tragic and what a cool monster Rodan was, because I was kind of used to him in his later goofier appearances.
Rodan takes him with a lot more majesty, and then he sort of becomes like a cartoon weasel as the movies go along.
Yeah.
Like in like Ghidorah the Three Animals, he's basically one of the Roger Rabbit weasels, and it's great. I love it. He's such a stinker.
Is this kind of stuff you're talking about? Because I don't have a lot of context, but like, is that why Mothra is like the sort of is not the Mothra we know? The kind of suit
Right,
issues
because
that they had, or
she's back in her larva form for
Larva
this
form,
movie,
yeah,
which is very weird considering like the continuity, especially with Mothra, is always so funny in these movies.
Yeah.
right.
In Mothra versus Godzilla, where it's just like, weren't there two of them? Yeah, one of them died.
But
Get
the
over
other
it.
one, but the other one's great. She's doing
The
really
other one's
great
great.
now.
No problem. Yeah, she's a moth or a caterpillar, depending on the needs of the film. Oh, okay. Listen,
Right.
we're talking about Japan, and the Japanese are not slaves to continuity in any of their series. If you fall in love with any anime series, or don't be surprised if the next time they make a movie with it, the characters have completely switched personalities. It takes place in the future, and it has nothing to do with any of the stuff that you've used to. That's just the way things are.
But I like that in regards to kind of the way that all these Showa era movies all feel. Obviously, they're all very different because they're just different plots, different characters. Like no one really carries over, except for like in the early ones when they bring back Takashi Shimura every once in a while.
Well, I mean, there's a couple people who like recur that are like in these casts, even to like the ending of it all, but kind of feels like in that true childhood sense of like playtime, where it's so
Right,
much like
yeah.
like this
Yeah.
time, I don't want to play with my big Mothra toy. I want to play with the larva toy that I have. So, he's a little larva, whatever. I'm 10. It's fine. We can do this.
And this time the carpet's lava. Okay, so yeah, all right, sure. Wasn't lava yesterday, but we changed things up.
But I think that does add to what I love about these Showa era movies, which is just like part of it is I think the visual effects thing, which is like they're figuring it out on the fly, like as they go. And I think another is kind of just just make up rules and whatever, like there is no kind of continuity. There's no like, start with like, okay, so in the last movie we defeated Ghidorah, but this time he's, there's none of that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I love it. I just think it's really great to, you get so many different kinds of movies here, different kinds of plots, and it's just really nice, especially as kind of now, at least in the 2020s, they've really kind of made it and kind of molded it into a proper franchise where it's like we have these characters, these are our characters, and we're going to carry them over film to film. And I like this movie just kind of being like, nope, new guys. This one's set in 1999 or whatever. Like, it's whatever rules.
The magical year of 1999. and all these monsters that basically died the last time you saw them, except for Godzilla. Well, even Godzilla died the first time we saw him. So, yeah, they're back. They got better. We're not going to explain it, but
I'm curious what we've been talking about some of the monsters. We haven't talked about some of like the side ones that do pop up. You got like your Baragon, who was in Frankenstein Conquers the World prior to this. A massive, like you kind of mentioned, misuse of Baragon in that he's in like 40 seconds, I think, total of the movie.
And they lie. It's like, oh, look, it's Baragon invading France. It's like, that's Gorosaurus.
Right.
Well,
yes.
Well, Baragon's right behind him. He drilled the hole and let Gorosaurus go first. But I guess the story was the suit was so badly damaged that they were pretty sure that shoving it through the dirt in that scene would have broken the ears off, and so Gorosaurus got his day in the sun. And and actually that was a great costume. Gorosaurus, he got killed by King Kong, and King Kong escapes. That's his whole.
He gets the lower jaw snap that like most of these monsters tend to get.
But he's a really well designed and gets a few good licks in this one too. He more than held his own, so he had fun.
Particularly that Arc de Triomphe shot, I think is really nightmarish. I think it's even worse because it's like Gorosaurus, like if you look at the costume, he's very T-Rexy. Like he has little arms. It doesn't make sense that he'd dig that hole.
No.
But him just like coming out almost just like he's on a platform, basically, just like rising up and destroying that Arc Triumph beautifully.
And did he literally drill his way all the way from Monsterland to France? It seems amazing, but okay.
He wanted those baguettes.
Yeah.
Motivation.
I also just love that in this movie it's called Monsterland.
Yeah.
Like obviously, like they later retitled it to Monster Island, but Monsterland,
which sounds less silly, but Monsterland.
Monsterland sounds like a theme park that I would love to go to.
Yeah.
They had like that's all I could think of while I was watching this. Like Monsterland, they should.
I would totally
park.
go.
Yeah,
they should open like a bunch of them in Florida. It'd be Monster World, and just they rotate the monsters around. It'd be like Jurassic Park, only with way cooler giant monsters.
But you also got to have as like the icon of that park, like it's Godzilla versus Gigan, right, where the aliens open a park. You got to have that big Godzilla thing.
Oh yeah.
That's your Magic Castle. That's like the perfect thing. Yeah. But anyway, enough theme park talk. I can't believe I didn't bring up theme parks.
I also thought about Jurassic Park while I was watching this because the beginning of this movie is kind of a Jurassic Park setup, basically, where it's like all these monsters are on this island. This is how we like contain them and make sure they don't leave the island or whatever. And like, I love that setup, by the way. I just think it's like so.
Yeah, how we did it, I don't know. But 1999, there could be some technology we cannot even imagine.
That's true. In the far distant future of 1999.
I love that they're just like, hey, it's 1999. We have the technology to do all this stuff now. We have like spaceships, and like it's it is just this like that childhood logic of just like there's spaceships and there's aliens and we have all the monsters on the island.
There is a bit of detail with like I do love how they distinguish like there's like the cloud things for Godzilla that they'll disperse and draw him away. Same thing with Mothra, has a different shade. So that's how you can tell it's different. They thought about this. But it's that kind of kid logic where they want to make sense of it. But it's through like one detail that's like, yeah, of course, no shit. That's why. We're like, oh, there's a big force field around. That's why Rodan can't fly away. Yeah, of course.
The powder's red. That one's for Mothra, right? Like, yeah, it's...
Right. Yes. So we've brought up a couple of these people. I want to have a bit of a corner about Varan, because as much as like Baragon isn't well used in this, Varan is like the worst, I think, of the Ishiro Honda monster movies. This is from 1958. The original Varan, and it's a very dull copy, I think, of Gojira, quite honestly. And then here he just floats around.
Yeah,
That's
he can
it. He's
fly.
Like,
yeah. Varan's a strange, but I've never seen a good copy of it. So I don't want to judge it too harshly. In fact, most of the copies I've seen were terrible, but it very much was a cheap Godzilla knockoff. He could fly, which made no sense. He's like a flying squirrel. He's not a terrible design. And they did have the costume there, but I guess, again, it was in bad shape because they just didn't use it at all. If you blink, you'll miss him. Manda, too. Manda needed more attention. He was a cool monster, but...
Oh, Manda's cool, yeah.
Yes, from Atragon, who I did also see recently. That's an interesting movie, too, where it's all about, like, people trying to, like, find a cult beneath the ocean, basically, Bryan. And,
sounds like my shit.
Like, in a sub, it's just like, hey, here's our god, and it's Manda, this giant fucking snake thing. And he's not in the movie that much, but I do love in this movie when they use him, like, especially that whole bit where, like, as Godzilla's tearing stuff down in the background, in the foreground, you got Manda, like, twirling around that monorail, which is, like, so perfect, especially the fact that we get the establishing shot of the monorail being in use before, and it's, like, such a brief thing that's just like, yeah, this is how this works, it's actually moving around. And now this toy train's gonna get destroyed by this big fucking rope monster, basically.
And I think if you go on YouTube, you might be able to find the deleted sequence where Manda and Godzilla get into a fight.
Oh.
Yeah. And they filmed it, which I'm sure, cost money. And then upon further reflection, realized that didn't make a lick of sense because they're both being controlled by the aliens. Why would they stop to have a fight in the middle of everything? I'm like, okay. I don't know how mistakes like that happen, but yeah, I really like Manda. Etrigan's got one of my favorite plot weirdness, which is this undersea kingdom pops up and starts blowing up ships and everything. And we're like, why are you doing this? They're like, don't you dare use Etrigan against us. And then they disappear. And we're like, what the hell is Etrigan? Which gets us looking for it. And then we find it and then we use it against them. It's like, hey guys, this is kind of like the Terminator, where the Terminator goes back in time to stop somebody and is responsible for creating the somebody he was sent back to stop. Just didn't think this through, you people of Moo.
Yeah, it's literally called Moo.
Yeah.
Great. What's the name of the people in this one? All of these have blended together from like Planet X to like, Kilak.
Yes,
I keep wanting to say Sleestacks, but that's Land of the Lost. The Kilaks. Yeah. Or the rock people.
I will say, while we were talking about the kind of monorail sequence, then I love that shot, and I think that shot's so emblematic of what I love about this Showa era movies, where like I love how like it's such a beautiful composition almost of you get like Manda on the monorail and Godzilla's just like stomping stuff. It's such a beautifully like composed shot, but also I love miniatures in movies. I love Ray Harryhausen, like the skeletons from Jason and the Argonauts are one of my favorite visual effects. I love them, because there is that, we were talking about that chintzier element, and a lot of that is with the miniatures and like the tanks and the little like cars and little like monorails and all that stuff. It kind of looks like a little miniature, like a little toy, but I love that, and I love all the stuff where they've built these like mountainous areas. And it's clearly, so that you can have the guy in the suit and it looks to scale and everything. And I don't know, that kind of stuff is it's fascinating to me because it is like, it's truly analog and you're getting like a real set and a real just kind of like thing there. And it is that kind of, it's the movie magic thing of how do you make this toy car look like it's like, going fast or being destroyed or whatever. Like it's, I love it. I love it in this movie. I love it in all these movies. It's just my favorite element, I think, about just all of these Showa era movies.
Well, and especially like that sort of mountain range you're talking about. Like that, especially when I was watching this time, I just realized like, oh yeah, that fucking mountain range that like was in use for decades afterward into Power Rangers. It's the same fucking mountain range. that any of those Super Sentai fights were taken from. And it's so just like endearing in a way, like you're mentioning, where it's just like that somebody like made all these different little things. Yeah. And had, especially like in this one, because like they were in theory thinking like, oh, we'll go out on this. It's like, guess what? It's international, baby. We're going to Paris. We're going to New York. We're going everywhere. And it does feel really like a big culmination point, sort of like, in its own way, kind of like an end game sort of factor of like, right. They're all here. They're all fucking doing it. And at the same time, we haven't talked much about the human element. But what I love about it in the human element here, where like, there's been all sorts of debate about, like, oh, should you have a Godzilla movie without any kind of human stuff? And what I love in this one is all of the human characters are just treating this all with complete sincerity. I particularly want to shout out Akira Kubo, who plays our lead, Captain Yamabe, is so good in this movie. I think he just has that great kind of, like, star charisma with stuff like the one line he has when they're, like, going toward the final battle. Will either be heroes or body bags within the hour.
Well,
great fucking line, which the English dub unfortunately turns into "time is running out for the human race."
Wow,
that's such a downgrade,
and that really matches the lip movements too. Yeah, I mean, watching it now, I still love all the monster stuff and everything. It kind of surprised me how much gap there is between it. You look at the poster. I remember the fight. Even the fight is just a few minutes long. There's not as I wish there were more monster stuff in here, but I think we've lost our patience. I'm sure that the amount of monsters in the latest Godzilla X Kong is probably way off the multiples of what there is here, because we're just not willing to do that kind of slow burn or build up things. We want to get straight to it. The exception, Godzilla -1, which is my second favorite Godzilla movie of all time. I always have to give the first one the lead, but boy, I'll bet there wasn't as much Godzilla in that one as I remember it either. But the human characters were so compelling that was okay. I could have watched a movie with even less Godzilla with those characters. They were great. I wouldn't say these folks measure up to that. I was starting to get a little antsy. It's like, couldn't they have built their their fortress on Monster Island, and we could have kept everything there and had a bit more monster stuff going on. It's like, we're going to the moon. I don't want to go to the moon. I want to go back to Monsterland. Come on, get us back to Monsterland. And let's see some more Varan or any.
The crowd needs Varan. They're all shouting Varan.
And they're supposed to have even more. They're supposed to have both Gargantuas and the sea monster.
Well, the infamous one was they wanted to have King Kong. They wanted to bring him back, but they had just done Escapes. And it was just like apparently a nightmare for the rights and
they
stuff.
They lost the rights. Yeah. Oh, yeah. RKO or whoever was in charge of King Kong was as greedy with those rights as Toho is with Godzilla. As Marvel Comics found out when they bought the rights to Godzilla and then thought they were going to be able to also use Mothra and Rodan. Like, oh, no. No, you're going to have to make up your own lame monsters for that comic book. And they did. I can't really see where Kong would have worked. Because really, Kong and Godzilla by themselves could take out Ghidorah, and the others would have just gotten in the way. Mothra and the spider spraying silk. It's like, okay, all right, you're getting this on me. Just stop. Let us take care of them.
Especially but one of my least favorite recurring like suits of the Toho era is the King Kong suit.
Oh, it's terrible.
It's so bad.
It's terrible.
And even by Escapes, it's like not at all better, but at the very least there's a Mecha Kong who looks awesome.
Mecha Kong that's the thing. If I had to pick, if I could just like blink my eyes and had a suit show up that I could wear, well, I'd do Godzilla. But a close second would be Mecha Kong, because Mecha Kong is great. But King Kong, no, it looks awful. It looks moth-eaten. And I appreciate that he's got the long arms like a gorilla really would, but it looks silly when he's running around like, he looks like,
I looked up a picture of it. Yeah.
It looks like Humanoids from the Deep when he's running around with his arms raised up. It's terrible. Plus, am I the only kid who was rooting for Godzilla in King Kong versus Godzilla? We were supposed to be rooting for Kong. I totally was rooting for Godzilla.
I mean, that one, it's interesting how the bias, because of the sort of billing, is to King Kong, who was more popular at the time. And then Godzilla just came along and said, well, we got Godzilla, right? We haven't done anything with him in fucking forever. Sure, let's do that. And yeah, but at the same time, I want to go back a bit. Bryan, you didn't get to talk much about sort of that human element we were referring to. How do you feel about the human characters here?
They're all very similar in a way of like, Bill, like you said, like there's not a lot of kind of monster time, if you look at like run time, so to speak. But you're spending a lot of time with the humans, and I like this sort of like cheesy is the wrong word. I don't like using that word really, but like the kind of cheesy way that they handle all these characters and handle just the plot of this movie. It feels very 60s, and it feels very kind of almost B-movie in a way, but in a good way, I think.
I mean, look, for me, especially in sort of the wake, like Bryan kind of mentioned, we've already done our Godzilla x Kong episode.
Yeah.
Our full thoughts will be there, but I'll just say, like, the big difference really is just in the fact that, like, when you watch something like any of these modern Godzilla movies and how they try and shove in these fucking terrible jokes, and it's so groan-worthy, as opposed to, like, here, everyone is treating the situation like it's the most dire thing possible. Yes. And I find that incredibly, like, earnest and interesting, especially in sort of, like, a modern, like, cynical time. I just find it so much more fascinating that it's like, oh, we're dealing with these, like, space people who show up with glitter. Like, in all these Godzilla movies, I just kind of love the fact that, like, the human race is really able to go along with shit. Or just, like, after the first couple kaiju attacks, I think it's, like, Mothra versus Godzilla, they're talking to the Peanuts, the little twins.
Yeah, right.
And it's like, oh, we got this, like, the monster thing. It's like, right, we know that.
Just another day.
Right, what's the next step?
Well, 20 years like of having monsters come, show up and stomp cities. I've seen things. You start accepting. Sure, why not? I do like the aliens because I love obnoxious aliens. They're like just one of my favorite tropes. These smug, arrogant people who show up. They all dress the same because that's one of our science fiction ideas, that in the future, everyone will look and dress exactly the same, and exactly the opposite is what's happened. They're just so smug. Get ready to surrender. And we're like, surrender? Hey, you know who you're talking to? They're smug about it. Every time they lose, they're like, oh, well, we'll just bring King Ghidorah. Oh, you beat him in about 2 minutes? Well, we've got the amazing fire dragon. It's like, it's just a UFO with some cartoons on it. Like, we're just going to keep kicking these aliens' ass, and it's not too difficult. They find their secret hideout, and we figure them out because they're just so smug about it. They're like, they're going to beat Earthling. Earth is so primitive. My favorite science fiction trope are these aliens who come to Earth and they can't wait to tell us how superior they are. And they always use some line like, you are like the buzzing of puny gnats to our great intelligence. And I'm like, listen, dude, you came a couple of million light years to come and talk to gnats. Okay, who's the weirdo here? If you see me walking down the sidewalk stomping on actual ants, talking like something from a Jack Kirby comic book, it's like, flee before my might, as I'm stepping on the ants. You need to fit me for a rubber room. You need to drug me and put me away for my own good.
Suit.
Yeah,
why not? Shout out especially to Kyoko Ai, who plays the queen of the Kilax.
Yeah.
Like, she's the face of so much of that, and she's so good at that
she is
kind
good.
of like what you're talking about. And especially like at that ending where like it's like, well, guess what? The fire dragon's gonna come, it's gonna kick your ass, and then Godzilla stomps in. Like, it's a great interaction where like you see a couple things like fall behind her, and then just as Godzilla's like stomping on her combat, it's like so perfect. I love that kind of shit.
Yeah, who's laughing now? Hot girl.
It is weird, I think, that this franchise has gotten me to say, while watching all these movies, like, oh, it's another alien species is using Godzilla to their end. I think that's such a funny thing that a franchise has been, like, oh, it's another one of these. Like, they do this a lot. Just how I think distinctive it is, right? Like, this plot is very different to the one from, like, Invasion of Astro Monster, even though they're kind of similar. Like, we discover an alien species and they're our adversary, but whatever, that's a different movie. But I like the way that just how they kind of just do different things with this formula in a way, or just the different design of like the aliens. I do love like the dress that they all have. Like it's very 60s. It's very like Yeah, I think it works really well. And like you said, Thomas, like there's aliens and the human race is very accepting, but there is this still kind of like danger, like a genuine kind of sense of like urgency and danger to the story, which I like a lot.
I think another sort of 60s thing in terms of just like we're talking about the cast of human characters. The one dude, Andrew Hughes, the one like non-Japanese person who's like in that control room, who like when I watched this, I watched both the English version and the Japanese version. And it's interesting how like, especially in the dub, they fully give him like a "by Jove, what's going on here" kind of voice. It's so good.
Tut.
Andrew Hughes, a guy so old, he was literally born, like, if you look on Wikipedia, it says born in the Ottoman Empire.
Wow.
Which is wild.
Jesus.
By Jove.
By Jove, indeed. They just...
And he's fine. He's fine in it. I mean, he fits in with everybody else. Sometimes when you're watching a foreign movie, when they have an American show up, the acting is so bad, and you realize, well, they just didn't realize that this guy was a terrible actor. Because he was speaking a different language, and if you don't know the language, you probably can't tell. He is totally putting the emphasis on the wrong word here. There needs to be another take. And I'm thinking of Godzilla versus King Ghidorah, the one of the more recent ones, where they do the flashback. They go back to World War II, and there's just a dreadful scene on an American ship. And Major Spielberg, they drop Spielberg's name in.
Oh, that's right.
Yes.
Yeah, that's
it's so badly done.
It's very weird. Yeah. There's sometimes like a factor like I think I have with Andrew Hughes or like Nick Adams in like Invasion of the Astro Monsters and stuff like that, where they feel like they get just the perfect person for that specific part.
Yeah.
Like Nick Adams is like
Nick Adams is
American
great.
astronaut versus like Andrew Hughes just like they just put him in the fucking like most British harumph outfit and it works. Or even there's like later on like the one dude who looks kind of like the My Pillow guy but really buff from Final Wars. The really buff dude with the fucking mustache. Stuff like that. We're just like, yeah, get the most exaggerated person possible.
The king of Seatopia from Godzilla versus Megalon.
Oh, yeah.
Yes, that's true. Right. Like a guy who looks like he should be on the couch with a beer.
The guy's got more body hair than Bigfoot. Yeah.
I'm curious, Bill, in terms of especially like the Showa era, where does Destroy All Monsters serve like rank overall for you? Where would you kind of...
Well, one of the things, I don't know if we mentioned it or not, but they were initially thinking this was going to be the last one. So they were throwing the whole kitchen sink at it and everything. Before watching it again, I would have rated it higher, but really looking at it now, it's mid-level just because there's others that I like better. Why wouldn't there be? Now, after this one, things definitely took a turn. It's it's sort of a high point in the sense that after this, things started going downhill, and there's a reason for that. Godzilla, I think, has always been more popular in America than Japan. In Japan, it was very much seen as a kid's thing, and the ticket sales were dropping with every film. And Destroy All Monsters, a whole lot better than Son of Godzilla had. And they dropped the budgets, and as they dropped the budgets, they used more stock footage. The films got cheaper and cheaper, which led to less ticket sales. It's kind of a spiral, and they tried to pull it up at the very end, but weren't able to do it. And so, it ended up taking a 9-year hiatus. I like it a lot, and it's hard not to like it, but it's solely of all the Godzilla movies, it's the one that rests almost entirely on one scene. But what a scene. Just, come on, how could, if you love these monsters, how could you not love having all of them show up? It's like the Universal movies, House of Frankenstein, House of Dracula, by far not the best, but you get to see Frankenstein's monster and Dracula and this and that, and Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, which actually is a great movie. One of the reasons it's great, we get to see all the monsters, even the Invisible Man. Well, we don't get to see him, he's invisible, but you know what I'm saying. You understand my point here. That there's just something about just throw as many as you can in there, but that doesn't always translate to a good or successful film. And I think I really love Godzilla King of the Monsters, but it didn't do all that well. It was kind of a disappointment, to the point where they were wondering if they were going to be able to make this, continue with the Monsterverse. It's one of my favorite of the whole series, but people disagreed. I don't know why. I mean, good God, you got Godzilla, Rodan, Ghidorah, looking as good as they're ever going to look. It's like seemed like a no-brainer, and a bunch of other monsters too.
Stay tuned to the Godzilla X Kong episode where Brian and I maybe talk about that.
Okay, all right. I'm looking forward to seeing that. Actually, I have not yet seen the movie. I'm planning on maybe going this weekend. But I really would put this upper middle, and I would have rated it a bit higher before I saw it again, and realized just how much non-monster action there was, more than I had recalled. But anyway, one other thing I gotta mention: when I was a kid, I had a Super 8 projector, a sound Super 8 projector. I got that for Christmas. What a present. And a Super 8 camera, which I also got into filmmaking with my buddies. And for Christmas and birthdays, I would get the little Super 8 films. Sometimes sound, sometimes color, not often. Usually the Castle stuff was pretty crappy, but I had a 10-minute Destroy All Monsters in color and sound. And it was basically a little bit of intro. It's all the monster scenes that there were and the entire final battle. Well, that's 10 minutes of solid entertainment. I watched that until it fell apart. And of course, with Super 8, every time you watch something, it falls apart just a little bit more, a little bit more. It fell apart like a love teddy bear that one day there's nothing but tatters. And so this movie will always hold an absolute. If I could only bring 5 Godzilla movies to the desert island with electricity and a, projector or whatever, it would be one of them, even though it's not in my top 5 Godzilla movies, but it's in my top 5 loved Godzilla movies. That's love.
Well, those sound like great final thoughts, Bill.
We all choked out, all for cocktail here. Listen, when you get to my age, and it's a while before you get there, nostalgia hits you hard, and when I watch these movies, I am taken back to Thanksgiving at my grandmother's house, except for my sisters, and my mom is still with us. No one's left. These movies take me back to a time, to memories, that are very important. And I am getting choked up. God damn. It's and that's one of the things about these all these things. Oh yeah, they can be chintzy and cheesy, and they're of their time, and some of them haven't aged well. But to those of us who saw them as kids, those formative years, man, that those stick. Some things will stick hard, and you'll watch a movie after so many years, and as you're watching it, and it was like Vampire Circus. I'm getting off topic here, but I saw Vampire Circus once when I was a kid. Exactly once. And then for Decades of Horror, we had to watch it again. And as soon as it started, I realized that I knew the next scene that was going to happen. I'm telling my wife, wait till you see this next scene. There's a shot where blood gets thrown on some ferns. And she's looking at me like I'm a crazy person. And by God, there it was. How does that happen? I can't remember what I had for lunch yesterday, but I was remembering individual shots for a movie that I saw once decades ago. When you see things at the right time, when you're at that impressionable age, old enough to form memories, but young enough that you don't have a lot of context. So there's a lot of room in the old noggin for space. Some of those will imprint themselves and you'll take them to the grave. When I've forgotten many, many other things, I'll still remember some of this stuff.
Yeah. Brian, where do you rank the story in terms of the show era Godzilla movies?
No, that was lovely. That was lovely.
That was lovely, though. Yes, genuinely. Yes. Thank you for that.
Oh, thank you.
Well, I mean, but for me, I guess like it is interesting because I've essentially watched this one last in the order of the Showa era because I wanted to save it for last for when we do this. So it's interesting to kind of jump this one and go straight to like All Monsters Attack, Gigan, and the kind of later ones and see where things go. And I don't even think like the later ones are bad necessarily. I would not say any of the Showa era movies are bad, except for Son of Godzilla, that little shit. But I think this movie definitely does feel like a culmination point, and I think I would say kind of Mothra versus Godzilla, Ghidorah, and I would even put Invasion of Astro Monster in there as kind of the peak of this franchise. Mm-hmm. And those are kind of the ones that I really think about fondly. Even now, I'm kind of like already thinking of rewatching them, which is great because all these are like max 95 minutes. Like some of them are like 80 minutes. It's so great.
This movie's 83 minutes long
It's
or something like that.
incredible.
It's very
Yeah,
short.
they're all just like really perfect bite-sized length. I love the kind of like, in regards to the kind of the human plot, I love that kind of 60s, you know, oh, there's space aliens and they look like humans and they're here to, you know, do something. And I love the kind of the way that they treat the SY-3 rocket. They're always like kind of going back to that and flying that around. I think that looks really cool.
Pretty cool
like,
looking.
All the mechanisms also to make that fucking thing where it just like it has to, like that one opening shot where it's like, oh, we gotta have to get the thrusters up and then gotta move upward. Like even that model work is so fucking great.
Yeah,
I love the models are really great, and I love models for sci-fi stuff because I think, especially when you're dealing with like space science fiction, I think one of the key things is like how things work and how things kind of fit together and, you know, how it reacts and all that stuff. And I think the model work in this is so great for that rocket, and just the like set, the interior of it is so just cool. And I love like the way the kind of flames look on the end of it. It looks just like, yeah, just really great. And it has a lot of elements, you know, like we talked about earlier with the kind of monster fights and all that stuff. And I will say, like, the human stuff, I think it's almost too like long or too kind of drawn out, in my opinion. Like it's not fully there. I still like it, and I still, every time they would cut back to it, I'd be like, right, this is happening. I'm invested. I'm trying to, you know, come on, let's fight the Kilax. But it certainly feels like it's kind of at the very limit of like how much I could kind of take of it before I would get really bored of it and get kind of like, okay, where are the monsters? But and just, I think the setup of this movie is so fascinating. Like I talked about it a bit, of like the whole Monsterland, this is how we contain the monsters kind of thing. Oh, these aliens are coming in and controlling the monsters basically and having them destroy the world or whatever. It's such a kind of simple, in terms of like a monster movie kind of setup, and for this franchise especially so far, but I really love it. And I think it's really great to see this on kind of this scale. Like I love, we talked about the Arc de Triomphe stuff. I love when Rodan is like storming like Russia.
Yeah.
Yes.
It looks great. It's a little funny. It's a little goofy, but it just is so. It's really, really great. I love that kind of stuff. But yeah. So I would also say kind of upper tier for me. But I think the bottom is not nearly as kind of low as I thought it would be necessarily. Like, again, except for Son of Godzilla, which is just so. Oh God.
I don't know. I think I actually really dig Destroy All Monsters, if nothing else, because like I do agree. I think the platonic ideal of the Showa era movie to me is like Ghidorah, the three-headed monster, because I think that has the great mix of like I think they do actually put like the monster stuff in like evenly with the human stuff, and the human stuff's fucking crazy. Like there's a space princess who initially shows up like a fucking newsie. Weird shit like that that's just like, this is fun. This is so like, and the assassin plot, it's so ridiculous, as opposed to like with Destroy All Monsters, there isn't as much of that kind of like spontaneity at this point. But at the same time, it does feel kind of like the culmination of just sort of like, well, we've gone so extreme and sort of maximalist. I argue we are kind of doing the same thing with like the model work we get at the ships, like we're mentioning, or the performances, like that whole sequence where they're trying to destroy like that fucking thing that's in the middle of the room or whatever. It looks like a hairdryer. They're just like, we gotta use the electricity bolt thing, and it's like, oh no, it's catching the circuits on fire. Damn it, keep going. Like, it's like that kind of stuff, I think, makes the human stuff really engaging and enjoyable to me in a way where it's not my favorite of the human stuff. But at the same time, I also just like a lot of the weirder ones. Like, I believe you have not seen Godzilla vs. Ghidorah yet, right? Because we're saving that.
Wow.
No, that's
our
the only
season
one I
finale.
haven't seen. Yeah,
Right,
so.
yes.
That's going to be a trip.
Get ready.
Yeah,
Get
get
ready,
ready. Get ready. Just when you think you figured it out.
Right. And I think the reason I kind of decided to go with Destroy All Monsters is sort of because, like we're mentioning, it does feel kind of like we're leading up to the pinnacle point of, like, what the series has kind of done. And just, like, putting in these different characters. Like, the genius that I love so much, especially as I've discovered some of the other movies, is realizing, like, oh yeah, Mothra and Rodan weren't originally attached to this. They just kind of teamed them up. after a
Right.
certain point.
Yeah.
And I just love that kind of spontaneity with a franchise where it's just like, let's throw this and whatever. But in a way that's still at the same time, because of like the work of Honda and all the other people involved, it feels still like there's so much labor put into it, despite the fact that, once again, this is all like silly bullshit. But with stuff like, I love the costume design on like the yellow suits. We kind of mentioned them earlier, but they look like so perfect for this kind of like 60s era space kind of thing in a way that, like we were mentioning, it reminds me of so many great kitsch of that era, like the Batman show as well. That kind of like popping color that just comes from, like, once again, incredible sincerity of just like the most ridiculous elements.
Yeah.
And I think it still isn't like my top favorite, like I said, of the Showa era, but at the same time, I think the reason we kind of chose this because, one, we didn't want to cover Gojira, not because it's not a great movie, but what else do we have to say?
Right.
Yeah, hey,
Right.
pretty good, influential, important film. Like,
And
yeah.
Right.
this series, especially if you were a kid growing up at that time, this was a lot like the MCU. We have Godzilla, we have Rodan, we have Mothra. Those are all separate movies that could exist in their own little universe. But then we discover, oh no, Godzilla versus Mothra. They're in the same universe. They occupy the same time. And this movie, this is basically the Avengers. All the storylines come together, all the monsters, are put together, and let's see what happens. And how could you not love that?
Well, and it is what I like about Destroy All Monsters specifically. I think is that, like, I agree with you, Thomas. Like the ideal kind of Godzilla movie for me is maybe Ghidorah or Mothra versus Godzilla. Like, I think those are kind of like, if I was to show someone the non-original Godzilla movies from the Showa era, it would probably be one of those, because I think they capture a lot, like most of what I love about this franchise so far. But this one also, yes, just feels like a maximalist. Like, we're putting everything there. It feels like really the pinnacle of kind of their visual effects work. Not that there isn't like great stuff later on, but I think the stuff in this movie, like, I've been like playing the movie on in the background, like on no sound, and just getting to the monster sequences they're gorgeous, and they're just like stunning to watch. I like the human element, and I like the kind of like, a lot of these also movies feel very like they are reactions to like the space race. Because they're all like, set in space. They're all like, alien monsters and stuff like that. And it is just an era for kind of sci-fi and just kind of this kind of like, bright, kind of poppy, kind of, colorful kind of stuff that I really like have an affinity for, and I've really grown to love it as I've grown a bit older. And I think, part of it obviously is that, like, it feels like we have forgotten what color looks like in movies these days a lot of the time. And just seeing how bright and how these movies just pop, and, especially with the monster stuff. And this one feels kind of like, not that I would say to skip like Ibira, which I like, and I would say to skip Son of Godzilla, but like, Mothra versus Godzilla, Ghidorah, and this are kind of that perfect trilogy of, like, obviously a lot of the classic monsters are in there, but just that perfect trilogy of, like, what are these Showa movies? It really just kind of sums it all up with those three movies, I think.
Yeah. Well, it seems like we're kind of wrapped up. I guess, is there any last stray things about this movie you want to bring up? I want to just shout out briefly. We mentioned Anguirus a while ago, but Anguirus has some of my favorite stuff in that finale, particularly the shot of him, like, biting down on Ghidorah's neck, and then Ghidorah flies up with him, and he's hanging on, he's gnawing into him, and then that fucker just drops. Like, that shot of him dropping is so great.
Leaves a crater in the ground. He's a scrappy little fella, though.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Honestly, and Anguirus, I think, is one of my favorites of, like, the sort of second-tier monsters, honestly. Especially for stuff like this, and even, like, as they go along in some, like, the Heisei Millennium stuff. Just Anguirus, I just love, is, like, he's clearly at a disadvantage for being just, like, on all fours and being kind of bulky.
Yeah.
But, like you mentioned, he's so scrappy. He makes up for it. That dude is gonna bite into Ghidorah's neck, get dropped, and then come back up to try and do it again. So good.
Yeah, he's fun. You can see why he's sort of a fan favorite, even though he's not in that many good Godzilla movies. But There's just something lovable about him. Where's his cosplay? Where's the people cosplaying as Anguirus? I'm walking around
People walking
Atlanta,
all over.
Dragon Con on their hands and knees in the heat.
Wusses.
Yeah.
No one would dare.
No.
I was gonna bring this is off topic of Anguirus, but like talking about kind of the alien plot of this movie, I like the idea that they embed these like, you know, little balls into people's necks to control them, which leads to like the great like scene where like there's these like police officers like checking people's necks as they come out of like the subway, and people are like, the fuck, what's going on? I like that, and I like that it like is the earrings with like our one of our kind of main characters. It's funny, but it's clever, and but it's also just kind of the right amount of like goofy and funny that I love.
To kind of, I guess, close everything, I really love the sort of finale montage of this movie where every monster gets a curtain call kind of bit.
Oh yeah,
Even
get,
Varan.
stare at the camera.
Yeah, he finally gets
Didn't deserve it.
No.
He just floats off. Like, we didn't mention that he doesn't even like fly like Rodan. He just floats.
Yeah.
And you're like, bye, like an imp, like a fucking great gazoo.
Yeah.
Just annoying us.
Poor guy.
But even like the thing is, even though Baragon doesn't get a lot to do in this movie, I love his little curtain call thing that cements him as just like the dog one.
He's a
Where
little
he just
puppy
like does
dog.
like a wave. It's
Hi.
so cute. That's some of the stuff where like that kind of the closest I get to kind of what you were describing, Bill, with this movie. You know, someone who didn't grow up with these movies, is stuff like that where it's just like these cute little guys who aren't really that little at all. They would crush me and kill me, but they're so adorable. Look at them.
They are
Look at
adorable.
'em.
It's like Monsterland is like Australia. It's full of really cool things that will kill you.
including big spiders.
Yeah, giant. Yes.
I guess we didn't talk about Kumonga that much. How do you guys feel about Kumonga?
Well, he's a giant spider. He's horrible.
Yeah. There's like,
I want to say this is an anti-giant spider podcast in general.
Absolutely.
I concur with
Yeah.
those. We aren't fans.
but the funny thing is though, like, there's shots where I'm like, where there's something like his eyes, there's like because you can tell it's like a rubber suit. Where I'm like, oh, he's kind of goofy looking. Why am I kind of scared at him? And then I'll stare at him for like a little bit longer. I'm like, yo, this is still a giant spider.
He's more of like a marionette, honestly, which is so interesting too.
Yeah.
How they combine that stuff.
Yeah.
Because Manda kind of is that in certain bits, but it still feels like I love also Manda's curtain call bit where he just like crawls out of the rock, just like, hey,
Yeah.
I'm moving.
I'm
around.
here
Like he's
too.
going about his day.
Got any subways you want me to crush? I can do that.
Right. And I mean, and especially just even the final one being Godzilla and Minya. Probably the most I can tolerate Minya is when Godzilla's just next and just like, all right, wave goodbye, kid. They're leaving. It feels like such a perfect like final moment for the golden era of Godzilla.
Yeah.
I like some of the ones in like sort of the later Showa 70s period. Like I think Godzilla vs. Megalon is such a guilty pleasure. Fucking like dumb movie, but so like colorful and cotton candy and bullshitty. And I'm so down for that. But at the same time, this feels truly like that end of the golden period.
Yeah.
It's a good sort of send-off point for the character that they immediately break. Like, what? It's 9 months, right?
Right. It's not long.
That's crazy. Did you know that, Brian? That all Monsters Attack was made in 9 months.
Yeah, you can really tell.
Yeah. Well,
But by contrast, though, at the same time, Ghidorah, I believe, also was like 9 months after Mothra vs. Godzilla, and that's wild. That's a fun one.
right.
Yeah, but like the thing with All Monsters Attack though is like, and we kind of talked about it earlier, but like it kind of barely feels like a movie in a lot of ways.
Completely. Yeah, it's,
Like,
it's
yeah.
69 minutes long. It's barely.
Yeah,
a thing.
and just like it feels like an after school
Mhm.
special, like
Yes.
PSA
True,
or
yes.
whatever.
Right.
Like that's which some of these kind of get into. I guess we haven't talked. I keep adding things. I know we're kind of wrapping up, but like the way the themes kind of are conveyed in these movies, and like Honda still kind of has a lot of that, like, you know, he treats it with like a lot of weight,
Mm-hmm.
and the later movies do kind of lean more into the like, and why did this happen? Because pollution is bad. Like it feels very like, you know, Masters of the Universe or like, you know, Captain Planet kind of thing.
Especially in contrast to like the very ecological elements of like particularly like Mothra versus Godzilla.
Right.
There's a lot about sort of like the environmentalism elements of it, but Honda just knows how to like weave that into like, yeah, it's bad for the environment that something cool's happened with a giant fucking egg or whatever. as opposed to like what is the name of the shitty like pimpled monster in All Out Monsters Attack?
Gabbera or
Gabbera, yeah, that
something.
thing.
He's the worst.
Fucking like something that's like, oh, this is all the stuff that we had left in the suit office that we hadn't used.
This is like he was reject. Like they gave him to Ultraman, and they're like, no, we're not going to use that. And if you're not good enough for Ultraman, you're a sorry monster indeed.
Well, on that note, I think that wraps up our discussion on Destroy All Monsters, but we do have to do our regular segment of Between the Lines. On every episode, Brian, myself, and a guest, like Bill, if they so choose, recommend a movie that, is kind of related to the one we're talking about today, or might be an alternate choice for, like, our C for Classic for Godzilla, for example. So, Brian, you're going first this time. What is your recommendation? Yes.
So, my recommendation, I wanted to go with one of the Showa era movies, because those are the only ones I've seen, and this is a classic episode. And we've talked about this one a few times before, but I just want to recommend it. It's not my favorite one, but it's the one that I think has just kind of stuck with me, and I keep thinking about it, and I just crack a smile when I think about it. Invasion of Astro Monster.
Yeah,
is my
great
recommendation. Is kind of, I think, the first real kind of goofy one of these, even though it is directed by Honda, of course, but like it's about a planet called Planet X, and it's discovered out in space, and just this is, I think, really the kind of one of the goofier ones, but I just think it's such a fun plot line where these aliens from Planet X ask to borrow Godzilla, basically, so that they can destroy. Is it King Ghidorah?
Yeah,
I remember correctly.
Well, initially Monster Zero, right?
Monster Zero, right? And then eventually King Ghidorah, and they will give us a cure to cancer as a
seems like a good deal.
Great deal. Might be too good to be true, though. Like Destroy All Monsters, I mean, they're very similar in a lot of ways, I think. Obviously, Destroy All Monsters is more grand and has a lot more monsters and stuff like that, but they both capture that kind of, especially the space race kind of sci-fi we were talking about earlier. It has Nick Adams, who we were talking about earlier as well, as Glenn, a great character who I love. He's just so chill and so just like whatever, and he fucks also, where he's like, she said I was moaning all night about like whatever. But this one I just really like for being goofy, but still having a lot of those elements of that Honda brought, and just gorgeous effects, gorgeous, like the fight scenes are great. I love the set of like Planet X. I love like the design, also like the weird sunglasses they have, like the thin sunglasses that
Very
aliens
Devo
have.
Yeah.
Yes, very Devo. I love it. I think it's great, and it's just that another just kind of middle ground of like, it's still a Godzilla movie, and it's still retaining a lot of those elements that Honda retained from the earlier movies, but you can see it kind of just moving a bit more into that direction of like, this is going to be a bit goofy and cheesy, campy, all that stuff we've been talking about. But I think it's great, and I just had such a fun time with it. I really like this one. I don't know. We talked about it a bit, but I don't know. Do you guys have any thoughts on Invasion of Astro Monsters?
I love it. And the effects are so pretty. The scene where these saucers are transporting Godzilla and Rodan in these force field eggs, that looks like it's right off the cover of some pulp science fiction. It's great. A lot of fun.
I like Invasion of the Astro Monsters. I feel weirdly like, I think I feel the way about sort of the human element in that one that you guys were kind of feeling about Destroy All Monsters, where I think that stuff just works more on like a sort of aesthetic vibe level for me. Like Nick Adams. Like, Nick Adams doesn't have to do much because he just looks like perfect for that.
Yeah.
It's just like and he's named Glenn, like you mentioned. It's full on like space race
Yeah.
era shit in a way that's like so endearing. But I think even like all the other stuff, like the aesthetics of like the actual the aliens, I love the way that their costumes are designed and they're like sort of weird headsets and stuff like that. And it does have, like we mentioned earlier, the Godzilla jumping up and down bit.
Also
That's so
great.
fun.
Yep.
Yeah.
And also one of my favorite dynamics of just like both Godzilla and Rodan being borrowed. And when Rodan appears, he just seems so pissed. Like, why the fuck was I brought here? What's going on? What the fuck is this? That kind of stuff where like that personality starts really rearing in with these monsters and stuff. Yeah, and even like the big reveal of Ghidorah. I just love that Ghidorah, like in this movie, in many of these movies, he's just kind of like, all right, we push the button for our last resort, and it's Ghidorah. And we just send him.
Yeah.
And I love that. I love just the way that they are like, because of like in his own film, his titular film, they already establish him as this like big bad, and he's like really like powerful and all this stuff. Yeah, I think it's really great.
Well, I'm going to go ahead and recommend my film here, which is Godzilla adjacent in that we do have our buddy Baragon, who showed up in Destroy All Monsters with us here. I have Frankenstein Conquers the World from 1965, also directed by Ishiro Honda. And I'm just going to read here the plot description on Letterboxd. I think it sums it up pretty well. During World War II, Germans obtained the immortal heart of Frankenstein's monster and transported it to Japan to prevent it from being seized by the Allies. Kept in a Hiroshima laboratory, it is seemingly lost when the United States destroys the city with the atomic bomb. Years later, a wild boy is discovered wandering the streets of the city alone, born of the immortal heart. So, this is all like very early into this movie, by the way, that this is established. And then this Frankenstein boy, basically, that's the implication, just like, oh, the heart of Frankenstein grows into this child who continues to grow and is like a human actor, not a guy in a suit, just like a human actor made up to be Frankenstein. And I think it's just like such a great display of how wildly creative these movies can be, particularly with like, I'm a big Frankenstein fan. I've said this many times on the show, and I think this is such a wild, great reinvention where there's still that tragedy inherent to the character, but the tragedy is that he's fucking turning into a kaiju-sized human, and he's gonna fight a big dog monster thing. Great. 10 out of 10. Love it. Just like such, and especially this has some of the great effects stuff where like you see him grow and it's pretty solid forced perspective stuff, and it's some wonky integration, you know, of like the kind of like rear screen projection, but especially like there's a point when he's like about half the size of a skyscraper and he's just walking down the street, and it looks so good. I just love the model work, like Jason's just like an actual human walking around in it, and seeing that scale increase, it's just so good. And particularly the finale, mild spoilers, shit's on fire. Literally. Also features Nick Adams.
Hell yeah.
Is one of the major characters. And I just think, that, yeah, this is one of my favorite discoveries, especially of the last year or so. Because I watched this around like last Halloween for the first time. And I was like, this fucking rules. It's so great. And shout out just also, we mentioned them a bit, but the Criterion transfers of these movies have been so immaculate. Like, feels, especially if you've seen any old, like I'm sure Bill, have you watched any of these on, do you have the Criterion streaming service?
Or? I don't have it, but I have excellent reason to get it. You know, now let me ask you, have you seen the alternate ending of Frankenstein Conquers the World?
I'm aware there's an alternate ending. The one on Criterion, spoilers, Bryan, an octopus suddenly comes up and takes him.
That's the alternate, yeah. Right. Yeah, it just literally out of nowhere. At no point have they ever established that there was a giant octopus. This is like, how do we end this movie? I don't know. Maybe a giant octopus shows up, grabs the lead actors, and kills them. The end.
Versus, what's the original ending then?
I think that was the original ending, and then for some reason they wanted to get rid of it. And then the ending we have now is he's just sort of standing there and sort of sinks into the earth during the earthquake after he's killed Baragon. It's not a whole lot better. It's a little bit more logical than an octopus showing up. That seems really crazy. But I guess if you're standing in an earthquake and there's fire all around, it is very apocalyptic. So yeah, you might fall into a earthquake crevice. Sure, that could happen.
Oh, there's a Cthulhu monster squid. That's what it is. Sure, we'll say that. This nature is destroying this freak of nature.
They brought it back for War of the Gargantuas, and if I understand correctly, War of the Gargantuas is kind of a semi-sequel.
Yes, in that they do reference them as Frankensteins. And basically, like, the DNA left over from Frankenstein is now grown into these weird, like, more furry, kind of ape-like big dudes. And that movie's fun. I think that movie is like, I can see why that was sort of like the sort of cult one of the two of those that kind of spread around.
Mm-hmm.
But I personally prefer Conquers the World. I think it feels once again that kind of maximalist thing we were talking about.
Yeah.
Would destroy all monsters in a certain way. Is it a favorite of yours, sort of like the adjacent to Godzilla movies?
Oh, I love it. I've got the poster. I actually have one of the
Oh.
original posters, which is just a
Great
magnificent poster where he's holding a battleship under one arm, he's destroying a jet plane with the other. It's like he's stepping on a bridge. No, nothing like that scene actually appears in the movie, but certainly that poster would put my ass in the seat.
Bryan Anderson, you haven't seen this one.
I have not. No, I've heard of it as I've been kind of diving into this, these movies and stuff. But no, and I want to watch it now that I know it's on Criterion. Yeah, I'm gonna be watching that. That sounds fucking weird.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, so good. But Bill, what about your recommendation for Between the Lines?
Well, my recommendation is the last of the original series, Terror of Mechagodzilla, which I am quite fond of. Now, it is the least successful of the entire series, of all of them. This sold the least number of tickets. And once they saw that, they said, let's put this to bed for a while. And it was another 8 or 9 years before we got another Godzilla movie. But I love it because it's the last Honda movie. They kind of like Bryan said, they brought him back. Things were getting bad. Let's roll the dice one more time and get the old team back together. But it was too little, too late. It's his last movie, I believe, that he directed. It's got Mechagodzilla, who's a cool monster. It's got Titanosaurus, which is another monster and kind of uniquely has never shown up again. Even though he's kind of a neat monster, I like him. It's got a goofball plot with mad scientists and I don't know. There's just a darkness to it. It's very serious. I mean, Honda very much said, okay, this kid stuff is not working anymore. Let's go back to basics. But he didn't have the budget to be able to I think pull this out of the nosedive that it was in. So it didn't make the people who had, by this point had gotten used to the goofy Godzilla stuff happy, and the ones who would have maybe appreciated a more serious tone had long since left. So it didn't do very well, but I happen to like it. I'm not a big fan of the sillier Godzilla stuff. I mean, we're just 1 or 2 films removed from Godzilla and Anguirus literally talking to each other with little comic book bubbles coming. It's like, I mean, I was always trying to convince my ex-wife that some of the stuff that I loved was not as stupid as she thought it was. But you had to be careful because you're like, yeah, we're going to watch this Godzilla movie. She's like, well, that seemed pretty damn stupid to me. And I'm like, yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, I guess maybe this wasn't the one I should have led with. I like it. Just the darkness of it. And the very last shot where we have Godzilla almost grinning at us, almost waving at us from the water is kind of like a goodbye. And I think when this was over, especially when they saw the results, it was going to be goodbye. This would have been the last Godzilla movie. But no, I think we've had 15 or 16 since then, and there's no end in sight. So this is a series. This is one of the most successful series of all times, and it will almost certainly outlive me, and I'm fine with that. I just regret there'll probably be a few I won't get to see. That's okay. My grandkids will. I'm introducing them to the wonders of these great movies, and that's I got to put some thought into that. These little kids. They're growing up in a world where things, the slow burn doesn't work so well. So what's the first Godzilla movie I want to introduce them to? I have to think. I'll be thinking on that a bit. I guess I better think fast. They're growing up.
Well, yeah, it's interesting because I just watched both of the Mechagodzilla movies last night. I was like, oh, I have these last 2 left. I'll do a double feature. It should just play nicely because they're both Mechagodzilla, and they're very different movies, I think. And like, yeah, Godzilla versus Mechagodzilla is so silly and so ridiculous, and I kind of like it, but yeah, like Terror of Mechagodzilla is very dark and has that kind of like, especially watching these in order, when you get to Terror of Mechagodzilla, you're kind of like, oh, where has this been this whole time? Like, finally we can have some like, some like real meat here, and really kind of, I don't love it, but I will say I think the fight scenes are really great. and they're kind of it's the thing we were talking about earlier of you can tell it was made by, Honda, even though he had like his resources were not as plentiful as they had been, of course, but you can still tell like there's so many just shots and just way he moves the camera that you can just tell it's made by someone who has been doing this for so long and has a real grasp on what this character is. It's one of the ones where the human plot, I'm kind of like, I really just glossed over it. I was like, yeah, they're doing something alien. They got to, yeah, whatever, but the fight scenes are great, I think. And yeah, Mechagodzilla is really cool, I think, still. Like, he's a really cool design. He's a cool monster. I agree about Titanosaurus. He's actually pretty cool and has a cool name as well. A very kind of, 10-year-old came up with this kind of name, but I like it. But yeah, what about you, Thomas?
This is on the lower end of the Godzilla movies for me, I will say. It used to be my least favorite when I first watched these. I was like, this is the worst one. I hate it so much. And then I did a similar thing to you, Brian, where I rewatched Godzilla versus Mechagodzilla and then Terra Mechagodzilla. And I agree with that. I think the original Mechagodzilla movie is kind of like, it's junky but functional in a way that I think is like fun. It still is like, it's mid-tier, but it's kind of enjoyable. This one, I would say, is not the worst anymore to me. But I think rewatching it still feels like the most fascinating thing to me is how it is kind of, and I say this just because like the budget and whatever and the means to make it, there's a kind of patheticness to the production that I think is fascinating just on the level of like Honda doing this for the last time. And you can kind of tell with, say, like the mad scientist guy who's played by the guy who's in a bunch of these movies, Akiko Hirata. I think it's fascinating with this movie and the other final Honda movie. There's kind of this almost like regret about kaiju being a thing, basically. They both feel like very regretful movies about it, weirdly. And it's kind of sad way that I find like incredibly interesting on just a meta-contextual level. But yeah, it's not as much with like, I'm not a big fan of Titanosaurus, quite frankly. He's a lower tier monster for me. Nothing else, because like his whole gimmick is one, a ripoff of Rodan, like his big power where he uses his tail to whoosh around and destroy stuff. And also, quite frankly, it looks like he's just crop dusting the fucking city. That's what it looks like. He's crop dusting the city with his fucking like gas.
It never made sense that even Rodan could just sit there and flap his wings and cars go flying through the air. But it does seem more plausible than flapping his little tail there.
Well, not just, I don't give a shit about plausibility. It just looks cooler when fucking Rodan flies over as opposed to like farting and destroying the city with it.
I will say one thing that there's one aspect of Terror of Mechagodzilla that makes zero sense. It has nothing to do with monsters or tails or wind or anything. The idea that this guy, this mad scientist, he's mad because he had a theory that there was a living dinosaur at the bottom of the ocean, and all the other scientists in Japan just made fun of him, mocked him, and kicked him out. They wouldn't let him play scientist games anymore, and just, he was disgraced. I'm like, what? Why would anyone in Japan, in this universe where monsters periodically come out of the ocean, dinosaurs come walking out of the ocean, flying through the air, destroying it, we've been knocked down about 70 times. What possible reason would they have for thinking this guy's crazy, for thinking, oh yeah, there's another dinosaur, one we haven't seen yet, but he's down there? But like, yeah, I'm pretty sure there is.
Sure, probably.
I believe you. I'm taking your word for it.
Yeah, I have no reason to doubt you, sir.
Right. So, it also just it does feel weird, especially when also there's like aliens constantly coming down to Earth and like threatening us. Yeah.
Well, I have a theory. It turns out that we just had the eclipse yesterday, and apparently we're the only planet in our solar system that has a moon that is situated exactly the right distance and size so that it almost completely covers the sun. Just a little rim of fire, and sometimes even a little more than that. There's lots of planets. There's over 160 moons. None of them have that. What if that's really unique? What if that's like something that doesn't exist on any other planet in this galaxy except for ours? We would be a major tourist attraction. So I go, when everybody else was just putting on their glasses, looking at the sun, I was like checking for saucers.
Right.
Didn't see any though.
Someone's got to be on watch.
Yeah.
Might as well be Bill.
People said I was crazy. Who's crazy now? Huh? Yeah.
Oh,
You're
well,
right.
on that note, let's end the Between the Lines segment by, as we always do, we repeat our titles. I will go ahead and go in the order that we went, Brian.
Yes, I had the 1965 film from Ishiro Honda, Invasion of Astro Monster.
And I had the Ishiro Honda film from 1965, Frankenstein Conquers the World.
And I had from 1975, Mr. Honda's Terror of Mechagodzilla.
Well, and on that note, we're going to start wrapping up the show here. But we want to thank some people. We want to thank Burial Grid for our music throughout the show. Purchase his music at burialgrid.com. Thanks to Michelle Kyle for our artwork. Find her at MishKyle96 on Twitter. And thanks to our Cineast Patreon supporters. Patreon.com/cinema number 2 letter, where for just $1 a month, you get, to vote for one episode that we do for every miniseries, and also you get bonus stuff. Like around this time, we're going to be putting out our full franchise, where we talk about the 9 Planet of the Apes films in preparation for Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes. Bill, I know you're also a fan of those, yes?
Oh, yes. Yes. A lot of fun.
Yes. I've seen all of them. Brian has not seen. He's seen like the original.
Yep.
And the Tim Burton one, which we're going to rewatch now. I know he loves
Unfortunately.
it so much.
Well,
And then the last 3. But yeah, you haven't seen the sequels to the original, those 4.
No, and I've heard, things here and there about what they're like, but other than that, I don't really know what to expect at all.
buckle up.
Yeah, I've heard, but I'm very curious, especially just because it's also a very long-running franchise that
Yeah.
they've kind of brought back now into the 21st century, and yeah, it'll be fascinating to revisit those older ones.
Also, just one of the original American sort of like franchises, basically.
Right.
Mhm.
Like
Yeah.
in the late '60s and stuff, developing all like the merchandising and doing these sequels kind of on the fly, and like that kind of, I don't know what the fuck we're gonna do. Let's do this with them. Let's go beneath the Planet of the Apes. this
Sure.
time. Who knows?
Yeah. Beneath the Planet of the Apes. That's, where do you see that one? I'll say nothing more.
And such a well-plotted franchise as well with that movie, Bill, as you know. Such a wonderful
Yes.
way to lead off, to pass the baton.
And just when you think there is no baton, the baton is gone. There's the baton again. We're still going. How? Don't you worry about it. We'll keep it going. We're gonna ride this train. I envy Brian. Nothing makes me happier than to find people who haven't seen some of these cool things. I know you got some fans who are gatekeepers and they're jerks about it too. Oh, you're not a real fan if you have blah 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 blah. No, I wish I could go back and see some of these for the first time. Now, knowing what I know now and watching things the way I watch things now, to have that experience. So yeah, that's cool. It's, there's a lot out there. There's so much out there. It's easy not to be able to find good things. So, where people like myself and Thomas can be of some use to society is maybe in helping to shepherd people toward these things that they might otherwise miss.
Yes, and you can help that usefulness to society by supporting us on Patreon.
Absolutely.
Nice.
Patreon.com/cinema2 letter. Make us useful. Make me introducing Brian to bullshit matter. But you know who does matter is Bill, our guest, last person we got to thank. Thank you so much, Bill, for being here.
Thank you so
Really
much.
appreciate
And
it.
summer is coming, and it's nothing better than sitting on the beach and reading a good book. Well, I've got one for you right here. The name of the book is Ram, Raum. It's my first published book from Falstaff Press, and it's a good read. It's about a lawyer who accidentally summons a demon. And boy, that doesn't work out well for anybody. So it was a lot of fun. I'm hoping to continue to write books. After I retire, I can just like watch movies, go fishing, write books, play with the grandkids. I think this is a great plan.
I do as well.
Well,
Yeah.
there's also that pesky thing I think you want to plug as well about your podcasting stuff. as well,
Oh,
Bill?
yes. Ooh, jeez. They wouldn't speak to me again. Decades of Horror, the 1970s, which they have me on because I was there during the 1970s. So I can talk about, I went to the theater. And Decades of Horror, the 1980s, also Video Store Junkies, where we do some crazy deep dives and make recommendations for films. And a new one, Deep Images. I do a lot of podcasts. Podcasting got me through the pandemic, whose name we will not mention because it causes all kinds of monetary trouble. That podcasting saved my life. Podcasting kept me sane. But now it's over, and I'm still with all these podcasts. So, yeah. But it was great talking with you guys. Thomas has always been just a great guy to talk to, and it's a real pleasure meeting you, Bryan.
Oh,
So
same to you. Yeah, this is so much fun.
You guys got a cool thing going on here. So wish you all the best. Thanks for having me on.
Oh, look, believe me, like I wanted to have you on some show I'm doing, whether it's this one or the other one, for some time. And I'm really glad we did, because like I love podcasting with you, Bill. You have such passion, you have such like a fun wit, but at the same time there's a lot of sincerity there, and I've missed podcasting with you, sir.
Yeah.
It's always fun to do. But you can also, just to shout out, in the future, I'll be going to Dragon Con. Are you, Bill?
Oh, absolutely. Yes. And Derek, the horror track manager, the guy in charge, he's got some really cool ideas. It was a lot of fun last year. It looks like it's going to be a blast this year. If anyone out there in podcast land goes to Dragon Con, oh, you really should. It's insane. Few things in life make me happier than having people come up. It's like, oh, I love listening to your podcast. Oh, I love Terror of Mechagodzilla too. Thomas is totally wrong.
Yeah.
Like, yes, one of us. It's so fun to have fans. That's such a weird feeling, but it's great. We've had people say, oh, you got me through the pandemic listening to your stuff. And like, okay, well, that's pretty awesome. Just talking about movies, man. You can't shut me up talking about movies. The fact that maybe some good comes out of it too, well, that's just the icing on the cake.
Yeah, and that'll be Labor Day weekend over in Atlanta.
Yes.
I'm signed up to do it, and Bill signed up to do it. So I look forward to that coming later in the year, if you're in the Atlanta area. And I don't know, I might post some of them as audio.
Yeah. Oh,
Patreon,
that'd be great.
Which I've done. I mean, I did that with our last year's panels. You were on a couple of those, Bill.
That's right.
Another reason to join the Patreon. More Bill. Fuck us. There's more Bill over there. We were on M. Night Shyamalan, which is one of the recordings, which was a very fun panel.
That was
one of my favorites from last year, especially you can hear the audience stuff. It's interesting. Sort of the reactions that we get. That was a fun one.
The audience was hot last year. Like this was the best attendance I think the Horror Track has ever had. And, Dragon Con audiences are sharp. Here's the thing. There is so much going on. There is so much fun to be had. If someone is at your panel, they chose your panel over a whole bunch of other things, which means, one, you better be on your A game. This is not one of those things where you show up unprepared and half drunk. These people are here and they could be somewhere else. But also, they're probably there because they are just as passionate about this particular topic as we are. Or they're just trying to get out of the Atlanta heat.
I mean, it's a win-win, really.
Yeah, either way.
Yeah, I mean, especially the sort of audience participation thing. Like, usually when I'm in an audience, I find that stuff very cringeworthy. Certain Q&As I've been through that are, like, rough. As opposed to, like you mentioned, Dragon Con, just full of great people. When we open up to the audience for panels, which we usually do, at least by the halfway point, people have a lot of interesting things to say. It guides the conversation in a fun way. It's a fun vibe over there, Dragon Con.
Definitely.
Yeah, and we're usually in the Westin. That's where most of our panels likely be.
The Westin. So here's the secret: if you haven't been to Dragon Con, it's got 5 hotels. It's insane. More people than you can imagine. Find yourself 1 or 2 hotels that you kind of more or less stay with, and the Westin's a good choice. It's a little off the beaten path, so it's not as crowded. It's got some food. It's got a Starbucks. It's more doable. Be real. Well, you got to do it. But when you go to the Marriott at some point, which is the biggest one? Is it the Marriott?
The Marriott, yeah. That's the big one.
When you go to the Marriott on Thursday or Friday night, you're going to be swept away in a sea of humanity. And it doesn't matter where you think you're going. You're going where the crowd takes you. It's a little scary, a little intimidating. It's very cool, but it can also be very scary. You're not going to get that at the Westin.
Yeah. That's a big thing. I'm sure, by the way, you're just selling, like I've told Bryan so many times about Dragon Con and how much he loves crowds and people. I'm sure you'd love to be a part of that.
Oh,
right?
yeah.
Conventions are my thing, personally.
You're getting PTSD just listening to us talk about it here.
I don't blame you. We're insane people.
Yeah.
We've been doing it for long enough. We just got a built-in layer to it at this point.
That's right.
But we'll be over there. Thank you once again, Bill, for being on.
Thank you, guys. Appreciate it. It's been fun.
Yes. And on that note, we should just say you can find us on Instagram or Twitter, Facebook, whatever hell site you're on, at cinema2letter. You can find me on the specific hell site Twitter, and the not so hellish one currently, Letterboxd, is at Not the Who's Tommy. I also do some writing at film-cred.com occasionally.
Yeah, and you can also follow me on Twitter at BRYANDRADE and the number 3, or you can follow me on Letterboxd, where I'm gonna start ranking these movies, man. All eventually 30 something of them, but I'm definitely gonna start ranking these Showa era ones. So that'll be
it's
lots of fun.
38, I believe, right, with Godzilla X Kong.
That sounds right.
38. That's impressive.
Jesus.
Right.
Oh, hey, you can also
Including
find
those
me on BillMulliganBooks.com. That's right, books. I've had one published book, but it's BillMulliganBooks plural.com. Pure balls.
Yeah.
Looking
just
at
promising
the
it,
long
you know?
view.
You're
Yeah,
promising
that's
more.
right. That's right.
Plural, baby, off the jump. Getting ready for it. Well, you can find us as well, on Apple Podcasts or whatever podcasting platform you listen to. If you're listening on Talk Film Society, our great podcast network, listen to all the other great shows that are on. And you can also dig into the archives in our Podbean main feed for, the past seasons of Cinema to the Letter, and also the Double H Double Bill stuff is all there. And, if you can't help us out with the Patreon, that's cool. Money can be tight, but the free way to help us out is just, rate, review, or share it around. Give us more visibility out there as we try and get off Monsterland. Please. We need to leave. They're everywhere.
There's big spiders. Please help me specifically.
Big spiders.
Well, before we meet Kamanga, let's go ahead and just at least tease Bryan. Our next episode, we've already recorded it, our Eye for Indie, where we talked about Godzilla -1. Now, we know you're asking, how does that quite fit? We explained in the episode, look, we had to cover this movie. We just had to.
Yeah.
And we were stuck on the Eye for Indie. But we cajoled our way, mainly because of the low budget, to argue it counts for this. It's hard to do that with a franchise, guys. Chill out. We want to talk about this great movie.
Yeah, that's a good episode. And we also wanted to, we were going to put it in the new category, but
Right.
we wanted to talk about the Monsterverse because, we have thoughts on the Monsterverse. We'll get to that.
That's true.
But
That'll be the one after. But yeah, shout out with our guest, Mel Gore,
yes.
who was great. Very fun, that episode's put together. But as Bill, you mentioned earlier, you like that movie quite a bit, right?
Oh yeah. And I think Hollywood should be ashamed to see this movie that cost $15 million when so many of the big budget franchise movies, $15 million probably doesn't cover the catering. Probably doesn't cover the salary of just one of the actors. It's and subsequently the movies have a hard time making a profit. There's a lesson to be learned there. You can, if you have a director who's also a special effects person, you don't have to farm it out and get a bunch of effects that don't match together. You don't have to do these reshoots. Disney should be ashamed of the fact that so many of their movies, the recent Marvel movies, have had to go back for reshoots. Reshoots means you didn't get it right the first time. You didn't have a script that was complete and just had to be filmed. You're making it up as you go along, and that's a stupid way to make a movie. And increasingly, it's becoming an unprofitable way to make a movie. So learn from this. For God's sakes, I love these films. I want them to keep making them.
By the way, how did you feel, Bill, about Godzilla finally at a spry 70 winning an Oscar?
I was so happy. When I heard it got nominated, I was happy. But then it was like, yeah, I'm happy. But what's going to really make me happy is if it wins. And I had a feeling it might, because the support for it and the fact that so many people were talking it up about how important it is that this film did well. But yeah, who would have thought, as a Godzilla fan, Godzilla was a joke to Hollywood. Godzilla is just a meme before there were memes. Godzilla is like just something you stick in there. The thought of Godzilla winning an Oscar would have been hysterical. And
a Japanese Godzilla.
And a Japanese
like
Godzilla.
A Toho produced one, not one of these American ones like the Monsterverse or whatever.
But all Academy Award quality films.
Yeah,
obviously.
sure.
Right, yeah.
Sure. Yeah.
And I mean, all the Monsterverse movies have marvelous effects, but I liked Godzilla -1's effects better because there wasn't too much of it. As a lover of special effects, that's what got me into film. That's what got me into making films. I don't like three-ring circuses because I don't know where to look. I'm afraid if I look over here, I'm going to miss what's going on over there. And too many of the films, a lot of the more recent Marvel films, have felt like three-ring circuses. There's 100 effects in every shot, and after a while, it doesn't mean anything. They didn't do that with Godzilla -1. They didn't do that with a lot of the films that I really like, the Harryhausen movies. And I'm not going to say Harryhausen movies, the effects are flawless or anything, but they're a lot more enjoyable to me than something that just is covering every pixel on the screen, has something going on. I don't know where to focus. I don't know what I'm supposed to be paying attention to. So it's just passive. You're just sort of passively looking at the pretty colors. I'd rather see a bunch of skeletons fighting Jason and the Argonauts. I know exactly where to look. So that's my feeling on Godzilla -1. I think it's a really great film, and a film that will hopefully open some eyes about how they should be making films. But we'll see.
Absolutely agree.
On that note, I mean, we have to follow that up next week, Brian. Past selves might fuck that up.
Yeah.
Tune in next time to find out.
Dude, gonna have to do reshoots on that episode.
This is what happens
that's
when you
true.
ask me for an opinion, you know. I mean, is it just like I blah, 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 blah.
Yeah, not like we do that either. No, we don't do that ever on this show. This is so tight and scripted of a show.
Yeah.
But on that note, everybody, let's wave goodbye. Like our monster friends. Goodbye.
Goodbye, people.
Bye, Minila.
Please take us off of here.